He had played killers, gangsters, and men forged from iron. But on one quiet night in 1952, James Cagney, the man America believed feared nothing, stood alone in his living room, defeated by something no audience ever saw. The front door had just closed. Pat O'Brien, Hollywood's friendliest Irish charmer, had walked out with another smile and another favor tucked safely in his pocket, a favor he would never repay, a request he didn't even pretend to feel guilty about. Minutes earlier, he had stepped into Cagney's home with that familiar, disarming warmth. "Jimmy, I need to ask you something." A line Cagney had heard for over 20 years. "What is it this time, Pat?" Cagney's voice carried that worn-down New York exhaustion. Heavy, reluctant, the sound of a man already surrendering. Pat leaned in with the same routine he'd polished since 1930. "Don't be like that. We're pals, aren't we? Brothers?" That word again, the word that Pat O'Brien wielded like a magician's trick. Because Pat knew exactly what it did to Cagney. He knew Cagney had been raised Irish Catholic. He knew that to Jimmy, refusing a friend felt like a sin. So Pat asked for what he wanted. A role at Republic Pictures, small but steady. All he needed was Cagney's name, a whispered recommendation, a gentle push, the kind of influence only James Cagney possessed. You could put in a word, just mention me. You'd do that, wouldn't you, Jimmy? Then silence. Not the peaceful kind, the suffocating kind, the kind that held decades of resentment Jimmy never allowed himself to speak. At last, he breathed out the word he hated more than any other. "Sure, Pat, I'll make the call." Pat grinned wide, clapping Jimmy's arm exactly as if he had never doubted the answer. "I knew you would. We'll get dinner next week. Bring Francis. My treat. Well, your treat. I'm a little short, but next time it's on me." Next time, the same phrase he'd used since 1930. The same promise that never materialized. The door shut behind him, and suddenly the room felt enormous, empty. Too quiet for a man whose entire life had been filled with noise, studio lots, shouting directors, blazing lights, gangster shootouts, applause, fame. Now the only sound was the echo of Pat's footsteps, and the truth Cagney could no longer ignore. For more than 4 decades, Pat O'Brien had taken from him time, money, connections, favors, and most painfully, loyalty. And James Cagney, the legendary tough guy, had let it happen. He hated Pat for what he took, but he hated himself more for never saying the one word that could have stopped it. No. To understand why this moment hit so deeply, why Cagney felt the weight of all those unspoken no's crushing him, we must return to the beginning, to the year 1930, to 2 young Irish actors trying to survive Broadway, where a friendship was born and where the trap quietly closed around Cagney's life. To truly understand why James Cagney stood there in 1952, drowning in resentment and self-blame, we must go all the way back to the moment the bond was formed. Before Hollywood, before fame, before favors turned into chains. Back to 1930, back to New York, back to Broadway, 2 Irish-American kids from working-class families were fighting to survive on the stage, both hungry, both talented, both determined to claw their way out of poverty, both carrying a fire inside that only the desperate truly carry. James Cagney was 31, a vaudeville hoofer, trained dancer, sharp-tongued and electrifying, always moving, always thinking, always burning bright. Pat O'Brien was 30, smooth, charismatic, effortlessly charming, an actor who could turn strangers into friends with a single smile. They met at a Broadway party thrown by a producer who liked surrounding himself with young talent. The moment Jimmy and Pat started talking, something got clicked. Same heritage, same Catholic upbringing, same bruised knuckle childhood, same ambition to break into motion pictures. Within weeks, the two men were inseparable. They became known as the Irish Mafia, Cagney and O'Brien, O'Brien and Cagney. To the fans, they were brothers. To the studios, they were a marketing dream. To each other, at first, they really were friends. They laughed together, auditioned together, drank together, held each other up when the industry tried to push them down. And when Warner Brothers signed both men later that same year, the studio turned their real-life friendship into publicity gold. The tough guy and the priest, the gangster and the cop, two Irish boys who made it out of nothing. Magazine covers loved them. Studio photographers posed them side by side, arm over shoulder, smiling like champions, selling the myth of friendship to every corner of America. And yes, in the beginning, it was real. But something else was happening too, something Cagney didn't see yet. A pattern, a small, innocent request here, a harmless favor there, a gentle nudge, a borrowed few dollars, you know Jack Warner, don't you? Maybe you could mention my name. And Jimmy, because he was Irish, Catholic, raised on loyalty and community, always said yes. Pat saw it, recognized it, understood it faster than anyone else. If you appealed to Jimmy's loyalty, if you used the word brother, if you wrapped the request in Irish warmth, Cagney could not say no, would not say no. Not in 1930, not in 1952, not ever. What began as friendship slowly reshaped itself into something else, something one-sided, something consuming. But to fully see how Pat used this weakness for over 40 years, we must understand the world the two men entered together. A world ruled by one man, a man who owned them both, Jack Warner. To understand how Pat O'Brien could pull favors from James Cagney for more than 4 decades, we first need to understand the system Cagney lived inside. A world where one man controlled every breath he took. That man was Jack Warner. And in the early years of Hollywood, Jack Warner didn't just employ actors, he owned them. From 1930 to 1948, James Cagney was bound to Warner Brothers under a contract so restrictive, so suffocating, it barely resembled employment at all. It was closer to servitude, legal, binding, and merciless. Actors signed 7-year contracts, but those contracts weren't 7 years long. Warner could freeze them, extend them, punish actors, loan them out, bury them, or break them. If you refused the role, if you spoke up, if you dared to ask for more, they didn't fire you, they destroyed you. Cagney learned this the hard way. In 1932, the Public Enemy turned him into a star overnight. The grapefruit scene, the iconic gangster glare, the explosive rage. Audiences roared. Warner Brothers smelled profit. So the studio put Cagney in gangster role after gangster role after gangster role. Always the hood, always the killer, always the criminal with fire in his eyes. But Jimmy hated it. He was a trained dancer, a vaudeville performer, a man capable of nuance, humor, heart, and physical brilliance. He wanted variety, different roles, something more. Warner didn't care. So in 1934, James Cagney rebelled. He walked off the lot, refused to shoot another gangster picture. Jack Warner sued him for breach of contract, one of the most aggressive studio attacks of the era, threatened to blacklist him, threatened to ruin him, threatened to bury him so deep the public would never hear his name again. Cagney returned defeated, but he negotiated better pay, more control, some power. It wasn't enough. 8 years later, in 1942, Cagney broke free, left Warner Brothers, founded his own company, Cagney Productions. Finally, he chose his own roles. And what did he choose? A dancer, a performer, a true celebration of who he was, Yankee Doodle Dandy. He won the Oscar. The role proved he was far more than a gangster, but the damage was done. Jack Warner had carved James Cagney into a box the public could not unsee. No matter how far Cagney ran, he carried that box with him. The world saw only the tough guy, the fists, the fire, the fury. And while Cagney was battling Jack Warner professionally, Pat O'Brien was doing something far more dangerous. He was using Cagney personally. A studio could own your contract, but only a friend could own your guilt. And Pat understood this better than anyone. But before we confront Pat O'Brien's long, quiet exploitation, we must step briefly into the shadows of Cagney's rivals, men who shaped his insecurities, men who carved deeper wounds, men who added weight to the burden Cagney carried, starting with the man Jack Warner truly preferred, the man who got the roles James Cagney wanted most, Humphrey Bogart. If Jack Warner owned James Cagney's career, then Humphrey Bogart owned something even more painful, the legacy Cagney believed should have been his. For decades, Hollywood saw two kings of the tough guy world, James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart. Two icons, two gangsters, two hardened figures carved from grit and shadow, but inside Warner Brothers, one of them was always the first choice, and it wasn't Cagney. From the earliest days of 1941, a quiet resentment began to grow inside James Cagney, a resentment he never spoke aloud, but one he felt every time Bogart's name appeared on a marquee. It began with the Maltese Falcon, originally offered to Cagney, a detective role unlike the gangsters he'd grown tired of playing, a real chance to break the mold Warner had forced him into. But Cagney turned it down. Too similar, he thought, too close to what he'd already done. So Humphrey Bogart took the part. Sam Spade was born. A cinematic legend was sealed. Cagney sat in a theater watching the film alone, and for the first time truly understood what he had lost, but the wound didn't stop there. The next year, 1942, brought something far worse, Casablanca. The role of Rick Blaine, sarcastic, romantic, world-weary, unforgettable, had been written with Cagney in mind. Warner wanted him for it. Hollywood expected him to take it. Cagney could have owned it, but he was leaving the studio, starting his own company, unavailable. So Bogart stepped into the role. Here's looking at you, kid. The line that echoed across generations should have belonged to James Cagney. He watched Casablanca in a theater with Francis at his side. He said nothing, but Francis saw everything, saw the pain tightening in his jaw, saw the silence that said more than words ever could. Then came The African Queen in 1951. Katharine Hepburn personally wanted Cagney as her co-star. She reached out. She extended the offer, but Cagney's agent told him it wasn't worth the trouble. Too far, too dangerous, too difficult. Bogart took the role and won the only Oscar of his career. By then, the pattern was undeniable. Bogart got the classics. Bogart got the prestige. Bogart got the films that would last forever. And James Cagney, the man who invented the modern gangster, found himself overshadowed by the man who perfected it. When Bogart died in 1957, Hollywood mourned him as the greatest tough guy in film history. The icon, the legend, the immortal. Cagney attended the funeral he said all the right words. Bogey was a gentleman, a professional, a friend. But later, in private, he whispered to Francis, "They're calling him the greatest tough guy. What does that make me? Chopped liver?" Francis didn't answer, because the truth was too heavy to speak aloud. Bogart became the legend. Cagney became the blueprint, one remembered forever, one silently overshadowed, but even that rivalry did not cut as deeply as what came next. For there was another man at Warner Brothers, a man who wasn't content with simply being a rival, a man whose bitterness ran deeper, sharper, colder. Edward G. Robinson. If Humphrey Bogart represented everything James Cagney lost, then Edward G. Robinson represented something far more personal, a rivalry built on pride, insecurity, and a bitterness that lasted 4 decades. Edward G. Robinson was the original gangster before Hollywood knew what a gangster was. In 1930, when Little Caesar exploded onto the screen, Robinson became Warner Brothers' first great tough guy, and that reputation, that throne, was something he guarded fiercely. But then came James Cagney, younger, brighter, faster, more explosive, a performer who could shift from violence to comedy, to dance in a heartbeat. And Robinson hated that. He hated that Cagney could dance, hated the effortless showmanship, hated the vaudeville roots, hated that Jimmy's talent wasn't confined to drama, it overflowed. To Robinson, acting meant Shakespeare, discipline, craft. To him, dancing was a gimmick, an insult to real acting. In 1933, Footlight Parade showcased Cagney's full arsenal, singing, tapping, slinging rapid-fire dialogue like he was born on a stage. The film was a smash hit, and Robinson, watching from a distance, let jealousy sharpen itself like a blade. He told a reporter, "Anyone can dance. Acting is what matters." Those words reached Cagney. He never forgot them, never forgave them. Then came 1942, the year the rivalry cracked open. Yankee Doodle Dandy exploded. Cagney danced straight into American history. And for that dance, for the very thing Robinson dismissed, James Cagney won the Academy Award. Robinson was not nominated that year, not for anything, not even close. Cagney's Oscar speech thanked directors, writers, crew, but notably omitted any mention of his fellow actors, a silence Robinson heard loud and clear. He sent a congratulatory telegram anyway, polite, professional, cold as ice. They continued to work occasionally in the same Hollywood orbit, each orbiting the other with a kind of tense civility. 2 men in the same arena, 2 men fighting for the same territory, 2 men unable to admit, publicly or privately, that the other was exceptional. Robinson had the classical training, Cagney had the brilliance of versatility. Both wanted the crown, but neither would wear it, because that crown eventually went to Bogart, and James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson were left standing in his shadow. When Robinson died in 1973, the world praised him as one of cinema's great craftsmen. Cagney gave a respectful statement. Eddie was a consummate professional, a fine actor. Hollywood will miss him. But privately, he muttered to Francis, "Eddie has spent 40 years thinking he was better than me because he could do Shakespeare. I won the Oscar. He didn't. So who was better?" Francis didn't answer, because the rivalry was never truly about Robinson. It was about something deeper, something Cagney carried in silence, validation, recognition, worth, and yet, even Robinson wasn't the one who wounded him most. Neither was Bogart, not even Jack Warner. The deepest pain came from someone much closer, someone who suffered while Cagney rose, someone whose quiet tragedy weighed on Cagney for the rest of his life. Her name was Joan Blondell. Before James Cagney confronted the man who used him for more than half a century, he first carried the weight of someone he believed he had failed, a woman whose suffering haunted him more quietly, more painfully than any rivalry ever could. Her name was Joan Blondell. Between 1930 and 1933, James Cagney and Joan Blondell made 7 films together. 7. And every one of them sparkled with chemistry so natural, so effortless. Audiences believed they were witnessing something real. 2 spirits connected on and off the screen. Joan was warm, funny, radiant, sharp-witted, grounded in a way Hollywood rarely allowed its actresses to be. She and Frances Cagney became genuine friends, inviting each other to dinner, sharing stories, laughing over the absurdities of Hollywood. A real friendship, a rare thing in that town. But behind Joan's laughter was a brutal truth Jimmy could never escape. Hollywood had rules, unfair rules, cruel rules, and one of those rules was simple: men age, women expire. In 1933, Joan Blondell was just 31 years old, yet the studio began giving her mother roles, not starring roles, not romantic leads, not the spotlight she deserved. Meanwhile, Jimmy, only a year older, would play leading men until he was in his 60s. He saw it happening, saw her roles shrinking, saw the system squeezing her out while it continued lifting him higher. And Cagney felt guilty, terribly guilty, because they worked in the same studio, because his star rose while hers was slowly pushed aside, and because he did nothing to stop it. In 1941, Joan divorced her husband and quietly struggled. She called Jimmy not for money, but for opportunity. "Can you help me get a role?" she asked, a simple request, and Jimmy did help. He used his influence to get her a small supporting part, a lifeline, but not a rescue. She thanked him, but then said something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. "I miss the old days, Jimmy, when we were both starting out, before the system decided I was done and you weren't." He had no answer, because she was right. Hollywood punished women for aging, rewarded men for surviving, and Cagney's own rise had unfolded parallel to Joan's slow decline. He wrote about her in letters no one saw until decades later, letters filled with guilt, regret, and a quiet kind of sadness he could never say aloud. Joan Blondell kept working, always professional, always dependable, becoming the supporting actress Hollywood called when it needed warmth but not glamour, charm but not a spotlight. She worked until 1979, then passed away that same year at 73, respected but not celebrated, remembered but not revered. Another casualty of Hollywood's cruel arithmetic. James Cagney outlived her by 7 years, and he felt guilty about that too. But Joan Blondell was not the person Cagney hated. She was the person he mourned, the one he wished he could have saved, the one who revealed to him the sharp truth of Hollywood's gender divide. But the person who hurt Cagney the most, the person who carved the deepest wound into his life, was not a rival, not a studio boss, not a forgotten friend. It was the man he called brother, a man who used that word like a key to unlock Cagney over and over and over again. We return now to the night in 1952. The door has closed. Pat O'Brien has left James Cagney's home, smiling, grateful, victorious, because he already knows Jimmy will do what he always does, say yes. But this time, something is different. This time, James Cagney walks to his desk. He opens a drawer, takes out paper, picks up a pen, and he begins writing a letter, not to Pat, not to a studio, not to a friend, but to Frances, his wife, asleep upstairs. A letter she would never receive. A letter he would never send. A letter she would only discover after his death, tucked away with dozens of others just like it. And on that quiet night, the words poured out. Dear Frances, Pat was here again, same as always. He needs a favor, needs me to make a call, needs me to help him again. The anger, the exhaustion, the decades of bottled frustration, all of it flowed onto the page. For 22 years, he wrote, I've been saying yes to Pat O'Brien, yes to every request, yes to every introduction, yes to every loan, yes because we are brothers, yes because that's what he tells me brothers do. Then came the line that revealed everything. I am sitting here trying to remember the last time Pat did something for me, and I can't, because it has never happened. James Cagney paused, but on paper, the truth pressed forward. Pat has needed me since 1930. Not once has he helped my career. Not once has he put in a word for me. Not once has he made a call on my behalf. Every favor runs in one direction. A lifetime of unspoken emotions came rising to the surface. My career is fine. I am James Cagney. I have the Oscar. I have my own company. I have the reputation. But what does Pat have? He needs me, and he uses me. Cagney then wrote the most painful sentence of all. I should say no. I need to say no, but I can't, because saying no feels like betrayal, like sin, like I am no longer Irish, no longer Catholic, no longer a good man. Pat didn't even have to say it aloud. The message was always implied. You'd do this for me, wouldn't you? We're brothers. And every time, Jimmy folded. The guilt crushed him. The obligation suffocated him. He ended the letter with a heartbreaking confession. I have allowed Pat O'Brien to use me for 22 years, and I don't know how to stop it. This was just one of the letters. There were 47. 47 written over 4 decades, documenting every favor, every loan, every moment. Pat pushed him just a little further. 1935, loaned Pat $200, never paid back. 1938, Pat paid him back by getting photographed calling Jimmy a brother. 1944, asked Cagney to speak to Warner Brothers, even though Cagney had already left the studio 2 years prior. 1953, Cagney calculated it. Across 20 years, he had loaned Pat over $12,000. Pat repaid $3,000. The rest, forgotten by Pat, not forgotten by Jimmy. 1961, Cagney retired. Pat called, not to congratulate him, not to thank him for 40 years of help, but to ask for an introduction to Cagney's agent. Even in retirement, Pat O'Brien wanted something, and Cagney still said yes. Pat O'Brien died in 1983, 3 years before James Cagney. Hollywood called them the greatest friendship in film history. Cagney was too sick to attend the funeral. He sent flowers, a short polite card, but in his final letter about Pat, written weeks after Pat's death, Jimmy finally told the truth. Not to Pat, not to the world, but to himself. Pat is gone. I should feel sad, but what I feel is relief. Then the line that shattered everything. The requests will stop now. The favors, the guilt, the brother talk, all of it is finally over. Pat O'Brien wasn't the man Cagney hated most. He was the man Cagney let hurt him the longest. And Jimmy hated himself for letting it happen. But the deepest wound wasn't just Pat. The deepest wound was inside James Cagney himself. For more than 50 years, James Cagney had carried a private war inside him. A war not against Pat O'Brien, not against Jack Warner, not against Bogart or Robinson or any rival Hollywood ever threw in his path. His true enemy was himself. The letters Francis found after his death, hundreds of them tucked in drawers, boxes, cabinets, revealed a devastating truth. James Cagney always knew he was being used, and he let it happen anyway, because he was a people pleaser. A man terrified of disappointing anyone, a man raised in poverty where community meant survival and saying no felt like betrayal. A man raised Catholic where guilt clung to the soul like a second skin. He played gangsters, he played killers, he played men who crushed opposition without blinking. But the real James Cagney, he couldn't even refuse a stranger. The letters revealed everyone who took from him: family, neighbors, agents, fans, acquaintances, and of course, Pat O'Brien. Cousin Mike asked for $5,000 to start a business. Jimmy gave him $7,000. Mike never paid him back. A fan wrote begging for help with medical bills. Cagney sent her $500. An agent asked Jimmy to help his nephew get an audition. Jimmy made the call, even though he didn't know the kid and owed the agent nothing. Over the course of his lifetime, James Cagney gave away millions of dollars, not to charities, but to individuals who simply asked, because saying no felt like dying. In his final days, in 1986, he wrote one last letter, a letter that stripped away every mask he ever wore. I am dying, and I am still thinking about all the people I said yes to when I should have said no. He wrote about Pat. Pat O'Brien was the biggest one. 53 years of yes, 53 years of being used. But then he wrote the truth he never admitted while alive. I resent Pat for taking, but I resent myself more for giving what I couldn't stop giving. He asked himself a question that broke his heart far more than Pat ever did. Why am I like this? Why can't I say no? And then he answered it. I grew up poor. Poor men learn to help everyone, because someday they will need help too. But I never needed anything from anyone. And yet I kept giving, and people kept taking. The final lines of his final letter were the most painful Cagney ever put to paper. The tough guy was an act. The real James Cagney was a pushover. That is who I truly hate, not Pat, not the studios, myself, because I could never say no. For more than half a century, Cagney played hard men, but lived as a soft one. And Hollywood never knew. But Frances knew. And what she did next revealed everything about the love that held Cagney together through decades of pain. James Cagney died on March 30th, 1986, at 86 years old, far from Hollywood, far from the spotlight that had once defined him, far from the people who had taken from him for more than 60 years. He died on his farm in Stanfordville, New York. Quiet, peaceful, surrounded by the only person who never wanted anything from him, Frances. They were married for 64 years, a Hollywood record, a testament not to glamour, but to endurance, loyalty, and unconditional love. She knew about the letters. For decades, she had watched him sit at that desk late at night. After another phone call from Pat, after another request from a relative, after another moment where Jimmy said yes, when every cell in his body wanted to scream no. She found some of the letters occasionally, read them quietly, put them back where she found them, never brought them up because she understood. James Cagney needed a place to put his pain, and paper was the only place he ever felt safe. After his death, Frances discovered them all: letters in drawers, letters in boxes, letters stuffed into filing cabinets, letters written across 40 years of silent suffering, hundreds of unsent confessions, dozens about Pat O'Brien, every one of them a testament to the burden Jimmy carried alone. She read them all, and she cried, not because she didn't know. She had always known. She had watched Pat use him, watched Jimmy feel obligated, watched the guilt eat away at him year after year. She tried to help him once, tried to tell him he could say no, that Pat was taking advantage of him, that friendship shouldn't feel like a chain, but Jimmy couldn't hear it, couldn't change, couldn't break the habits built from childhood poverty, Catholic guilt, and a lifetime of pleasing everyone except himself. So Frances kept the letters. She did not destroy them. She did not publish them. She did not exploit them. She protected them. She protected Jimmy's truth. She protected the real man behind the Hollywood legend. Before Frances died in 1994, at age 95, she left one final instruction with her estate. Keep Jimmy's letters sealed for 30 years. Then if anyone asks, let them be seen. Not sold, not printed, just seen, so people may understand. And in 2024, exactly 30 years later, the estate honored her wish. They released the letters, not all of them, only those about Pat O'Brien, the friend who wasn't a friend, the brother who only took, the man who helped shape James Cagney's lifelong regret. When asked if Frances wanted the letters revealed, her niece answered with disarming simplicity, so people would finally understand the tough guy was a good man, too good, and it cost him. The letters exposed a heartbreaking truth the world had never seen. James Cagney, the ultimate tough guy, the man who glared, punched, and blazed through Hollywood history, was in real life gentle, generous, too trusting, too loyal, too afraid of disappointing the people he loved. Pat O'Brien used him for 53 years, and Cagney let him, because saying no felt like betrayal, and in the end, the only person he ever truly hated, the only person he could never forgive, was himself. For being the tough guy the world worshipped, but not the tough guy he needed to be.